I call Porter Williams.
Thank you. Mai taki mata, Mr Speaker. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on the Arts Centre of Christchurch Bill. Firstly, acknowledgements to you, the Honourable Nicky Wagner, for bringing this bill, guiding this bill in its passage through the House, and there is widespread support for what this bill aims to do. I do also need to acknowledge Jean Crawford and Andre Lovett from the Trust Board itself, and I further want to acknowledge the Honourable Margaret Austin, who is a former Labour member and someone for whom the Christchurch community owes a great debt of gratitude in her desire to ensure that our city and our province recovers well. The Trust Board has worked tirelessly, and it's an extraordinary piece of legislation in that their trust deeds and their objects and the powers with which they will work under and all the provisions that provide for the Trust Board are enshrined in legislation, and it's not it's not the normal way that you would do things, but it is a very significant and important step to ensure that the work that is done to restore the buildings on that site go ahead. So I acknowledge and support the aims of the Trust Board. This legislation, Mr Speaker, has three main aims. To create the legal framework with which the work can be conducted, to amend the governance structure, to ensure that the right people with the right skills at the right time are in a position to ensure that this work is carried out. And the last is to enable and to respond and to the recovery work that's required post the earthquakes. And it's significant, Mr Speaker, because as you've heard other members in the House this evening speak about what the centre means to them, not just the centre, but the general precinct and the area which suffered significant damage, we're talking not just about buildings and not just about land, sir. We're talking about areas where people and families congregated and shared time together, and each one of those stones within the building, each piece of wood, each window, each area of courtyard and pavement has a memory, and the memories are of times that were spent there by students, happy times, perhaps stressful times too if you were a student and trying to get through your exams. But there is more to this precinct than just the bricks, than just the stone. And it is significant that we acknowledge that that is part of the recovery and the restoration process. So other members have talked about the trust being set up in 1978, and my colleague, Dr. Megan Woods, talked about how that came to pass in the early 1970s. And I want to talk a little bit about the objects of the bill because this piece of legislation enshrines those. So the objects really are ensuring that we hold and develop the Arts Centre, the site, the buildings in trust as a unique and outstanding cultural centre for use by the people of Christchurch and its visitors. And I know pre-moving to Christchurch to live there, I had, when I was visiting family in Christchurch, it would always be one of the places that we went to because it always had the best coffee. They were great. The market on the weekend was a great place to pick up knickknacks, and it holds the artisans that were at work there. It was extraordinary to be able to watch the artisans at work using crafts from a time gone past. One of the other objects, sir, is fostering, promoting and facilitating interest and involvement in art, culture, creativity, the creative industries and education. and there is no cooler place to go if you were going to see a play, to hear music, or just really to generally share in culture than the Arts Centre. This bill also, Mr. Speaker, enshrines the powers of the Trust, which include having the capacity to ensure that any activity that the Trust Board deems necessary is able to be carried out, and that at any time they are requiring to acquire property, they are needing to even demolish buildings or make changes, employ staff. All of those are within this legislation, and the legislation is unable to be changed except so that the work of the Trust Board can go on as it needs to through this period through to 2019. Further, there are two main parts of the bill, Mr. Speaker. The first sets out its purpose, its definitions around the committee, around the trust deed, the schedules. They describe the schedules which will provide the detail of the land and the buildings within the bill. Part 2 sets out the objects of the trust, and the bill concludes with the schedules which describe the land and the constitution of the Trust Board. But any discussion regarding heritage buildings in Christchurch, Mr. Speaker, cannot be held without thinking about Section 38 and the loss of heritage to the city. And why I refer to that in context to other comments is that I know that over the last few summers, as the fences have started to come down in the central city, and as people have been able to go back into the city and some of the rebuilding work has been carried out, that many people were reluctant to return because they didn't want to see the devastation that was there. And it has been a traumatic, a re-traumatising of our population, I guess, in a sense, to go back into the city and see just what needs to be done and just what has been lost. And I ask the government to think long and hard about whether we had properly used Section 38 when we were considering the demolition of many of those heritage buildings. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Because the buildings, and my colleague Jan Logie referred to Eugenie Sage referred to also the cathedral. When I talk about the cathedral and when I talk about the significant heritage buildings in Christchurch, I liken them to when we discuss our whakapapa and our pepeha, that the maunga within that, for those of us who do not have a connection to that part of the world in terms of our cultural heritage, that the maunga that we can refer to are just those buildings, are the cathedral and the Arts Centre and the significant beauty that our heritage buildings brought to the area. And many of my colleagues have talked about the numbers of buildings that were lost during within the Four Avenues area, 20% of our heritage buildings. It is significant. In order for recovery to occur to the fullest extent, we must acknowledge what we have lost and what has passed, and ensure that we do not lose any more. So I commend this bill, Mr. Speaker, to the House, and I encourage the government to consider carefully the recovery of Christchurch. The recovery hasn't completed. There are still many areas where people are wanting this government to step up, and Mr. Speaker, I can't go past the eastern suburbs in that comment, of course, where we are still to have our horizontal infrastructure completed so that we can fully be recovered. So thank you to Nikki Wagner, the Honourable Nikki Wagner. It is a great bill. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Luke Korako.
Kia ora, e te mana whakaua. Sir, I